Welcome, attendees, presenters to this event, New Developments in Online Extremism and Implications for Youth Work. To begin with, just a couple of administrative details. We're going to record this event and put it online for the people who had other meetings or for other reason they couldn't attend. Also, I guess you have noticed that your mics and cameras are off. However, you can ask, and I really encourage you to ask anytime questions in the chat function or to make comments. We will pick up on them and address them to the speakers. Our agenda is actually quite simple. We're going to start with a keynote by Jakob Guhl from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, followed by a short period of questions and then a panel discussion with the rest of the participants, whom I will introduce later. But before I do this, I think I should probably mention why we're organizing this event today. This is the final event of a project, which is called CAYET, focused on capacity building in youth work in dealing with new forms of extremism. It is an Erasmus Plus project, a small-scale project, and what it did is to develop 2 repositories for the purposes of youth work in the area of preventing violent extremism. One of the repositories, it's called, actually, they're both in German, so it is for the German-speaking part of Europe. However, and this is one of the points of Erasmus Plus, of course, is to disseminate these results broadly and also to explore to which extent we can actually roll out these kinds of outputs to other countries and other languages as well. So the first repository is focusing on scientific content. So it's giving an overview of extremist scenes in Austria and Germany, main concepts, main theories, but obviously in an accessible way. And also the latest developments. So the idea for it being youth workers need to be up to date with what's going on in the extremist scenes, so their work can be optimized in that sense. The second repository, whose link will also be put on the chat, is a collection of actual tools, so practical tools to apply in the youth work. And both of these repositories are focusing especially on jihadism and right-wing extremism. We, of course, are thinking of expanding this to also other areas of extremism, but again, it was a small-scale project, and this is what we managed to achieve. However, I think they are interesting, so I encourage you to have a look, check out the links that were put in the chat for these 2 repositories. And with this, I will go to our main speaker today, who is Jakob Guhl from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and he will talk to us about the evolving landscape of online extremism. A couple of background information, although he might be known to the people working in this field already and very well. He's focusing on topics such as disinformation extremism, both jihadism, Salafism, but also right-wing extremism, in particular in Germany, but also in Western Europe more broadly. He is senior manager in policy and research at the ISD. He has advised a number of German authorities at the federal and local level. He has published in quite a lot of newspapers. I'm just going to mention Die Zeit at this point, and CNN as well, TV stations. So he's very well known. And of course, there are a couple of very interesting and important research reports that ISD has produced and where he was either author or co-author. So I encourage you to visit their website and check them out. With this, I give you the floor, Jakob, 20 minutes. I will be ruthless regarding the 20 minutes and really look forward to your input. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Daniela. That shouldn't be an issue. So I'll be speaking about the evolving landscape of online extremism, and I will be speaking specifically about 6 points, 6 kind of theses that I hope can kind of set the stage for our subsequent discussion. So there's 6 trends I really want to highlight today, and they are I think we're visiting the internationalization of the extreme right facilitated by social media on a few different levels. We're seeing that formal extremist discussion organizations are becoming less relevant, and that often people operate in a kind of post-organizational setting. We are witnessing, especially online, but also increasingly in offline protest movements associated with extremism, that the lines between extremism and adjacent harms, such as disinformation, conspiracy theories, and harassment, are becoming increasingly blurred. While a lot of focus has been on the extreme right over the last few years, where Islamist extremists, of course, continue to operate, and they are drawing on a growing range of formats to communicate their message. The 5th thesis is that there's a kind of convergence online in terms of the subcultural aesthetics across different extremist and authoritarian movements, across ideologies, across geographic contexts. And lastly, kind of on the platform level, that the shifting platform landscape and the migrations away from big platforms may make it harder to appropriately research, track, and also counter extremism online. Yeah. Great. So in terms of the internationalization of the extreme right, I think this is really happening on a few levels. We see this in terms of the ideas and ideologies, but also in terms of identities and communities. On a level of ideas and ideologies, the best example to demonstrate this really is the Great Replacement theory, which was originally coined by relatively obscure French far-right philosophers, was taken up by the identitarian movement, including the Identitäre Bewegung in Germany, in Austria, pushed through social media, adopted by the alt-right in the US in 2015 to 2017, very prominently, of course, chanted in Charlottesville, the slogan, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us," and something that has now continued to inspire extreme right attacks across the world, in Christchurch, in Poway, in Pittsburgh, in Halle. And so this is really a kind of transnational exchange, the promotion of ideas across borders. But it's not purely on this level. It's also in terms of the kind of identities that are being formed. Some of the propaganda, you see one example on the bottom left by the identitarian movement, which again, quite active in the German-speaking context as well. They're also increasingly emphasizing not just the kind of national identity, but a broader European, often implicitly white or racial idea. So it's a forming of a transnational idea within extreme right communities. The Halle attacker in his live stream and manifesto referred to himself not just as a kind of German nationalist, but expressed concern about the situation of white communities supposedly under siege worldwide. And you really see in the online space that people are forming transnational communities as well. So it's, I think, different to how it would have been in the 60s or 70s, where, of course, there were some far-right philosophers and activists that had intentions to create transnational communities. You do have a much lower threshold to actually form these communities online, inspire each other, and share instructional material to commit far-right attacks. And so I think the ease of forming transnational communities has greatly increased. Connected to this trend is the second thesis that formal extremist organizations are becoming less relevant. This is not necessarily a completely new phenomenon. I mean, there have been different thinkers, if you may call it like that, both in jihadist circles as well as in extreme right circles, who have hypothesized that really you should lead a leaderless resistance, or you should inspire leaderless resistance where there's no formal hierarchies and clear structures, not like, the old school Al-Qaeda type organizations or formally organized white supremacist groups, but that instead there should be autonomous cells, autonomous actors that conduct attacks. Louis Beam in the US was very inspirational here, Abu Musab al-Suri in the jihadist context. And we are seeing some of this manifest now as well. The graphic on the bottom here, which is from the RTV trend report and from the University of Oslo in 2021, you see actually that the majority of plots on the extreme right are not perpetrated anymore by people who are organized as part of formal groups. And I think social media dynamics play a huge role here, as they make it possible to kind of get in contact with extremist ideas, in contact with extremist networks, without necessarily joining your offline, formally organized groups. The third trend that I really want to highlight is that some of the lines between extremism and different adjacent harms are becoming more blurry. We're seeing this very much in the online space, where you see on platforms like Telegram that conspiracy theorists, skeptics of traditional medicine, QAnon adherents, neo-Nazis, people supportive of the identitäre Bewegung. Again, people who may have all kinds of disagreements in terms of their worldview are operating in the same spaces, are forwarding each other's content, and are therefore forming these kind of hybrid communities where it's increasingly difficult to clearly delineate between different groups, between the audiences of different influencers, and by the different harms they may commit. And this is to some extent manifesting in the offline world as well. On the bottom, for those that don't speak German, I'll kind of explain what it is. This is the statistics from the Federal Crime Agency on politically motivated crime over the last year. And really the crucial number on the bottom right, there is the plus 147%, which is the increase of politically motivated crime committed by people that can't quite be categorized as merely far right, far left, religious extremism, Islamist extremism, related to the PKK or so, the kind of traditional categories through which they monitor these kind of crimes. But you see similar trends in the UK as well. I mean, on the top right, there's the kind of a graph showing the prevent referrals by the type of ideology, and really the category that you see there that's most on the right, the kind of darker line, is a category that's called mixed, unclear, and unstable. So this can be people who believe a mixture of ideological elements. It's a kind of grab bag of different ideologies, people who may be interested in the Nazis, who may be reading Salafi jihadist propaganda, who are maybe quite interested in Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And you really struggle, or certainly the authorities struggle, to put this in one of the existing categories that we're familiar with previously and under which they would have categorized these things previously. And so this is what I think is an increasing hybridization of different extremist communities facilitated by social media. So the first 3 points were mainly, though not exclusively, about the extreme right, as well as this kind of new extremism that's a little bit hard to categorize. But the threat by Islamist extremism, of course, continues. And despite the relative decline of ISIS, certainly in terms of territory, but also to some extent its online presence, there's a continuing kind of culture war being waged by different Salafist and Islamist extremist influences online. And what we've really been observing in our research here is that they're drawing on a very wide and increasing range of formats to give advice on pretty much every aspect of life to their followers. And this includes sermons and speeches, podcasts, kind of citizen journalism, where you can follow different influencers, how they go to protests, how they interview people in the shopping centers. You see a lot of animations that outline historical events from an ideological Islamist perspective, quotes from religious scriptures and kind of narrations built on those, as well as nasheeds, the kind of religious chants. And this really covers a very, very wide range of topics, from the political, the kind of calling for the establishment of a caliphate, calling for attacks on political opponents, denigrating political opponents. But you also see a lot of guidance on seemingly more mundane aspects of life. Am I allowed to do sports? Am I allowed to do this in mixed groups? Can I listen to music? Is it allowed for me to play video games? Is it allowed for me to play video games if there's any kind of fantasy beings being depicted that could be perceived as a form of polytheism from a sort of very strict perspective? And so, as this really are ideologies that seek to influence people in their everyday life and sort of try to give them guidance and a strong moral code in a often chaotic seeming world, like I think it's quite crucial to look at the furthest, broader spectrum of content that is being shared by Islamist influencers, and not just on the kind of political side and the kind of pro-violent side. There is, and this is really a fairly new phenomenon over the last few years, but there is a kind of convergence in terms of, there's an aesthetical convergence across a range of very different communities. I think we probably all still remember the rise of the alt-right from sort of 2014, 2015 onwards, and how it became associated not just with the kind of recrudescence of white nationalist ideas, but also with a certain aesthetic, with online subcultures, with memes, with Pepe the Frog, with different kind of jokes, the emphasis on very transgressive humor, attacking political opponents by trolling them. And some of the examples from the extreme right can be seen here on the top. Depictions of extreme right ideology, but using this kind of humorous language, humorous depiction, memes, and this traveled across borders. This wasn't confined to the US. We've at ISD monitored how this spread into Austria, into Germany, into Italy, Sweden. It really was picked up anywhere that there was a kind of active far right that was digitally savvy and was able to draw on some of these things that were being communicated and shared on social media elsewhere. What's very interesting over the past few years is now that we're seeing similar memes and jokes and kind of aesthetics being adopted by people on the Salafi spectrum as well. The kind of memes on the bottom here are all from different Salafi groups, using memes to celebrate the victory of the Taliban last year and the fall of Kabul, communicating certain very regressive gender norms, kind of making references to red pilling, even specifically red pilling, of course, in the alt-right and extreme right context, was kind of the idea that you should have a recognition that really society is structured out around race, and that whites are drawing the kind of short end of the stick in this kind of racial hierarchy. So it was connected to extreme right ideology there, but it's something that's now being adopted by people who mix Salafi and Islamist extremist ideology with the kind of cultural and online reference points of the alt-right. And it's not even confined to Salafism. This isn't like the second movement that's doing this. You find this across a range of authoritarian movements internationally now. You find it amongst Egyptian neo-Nazis, Moroccan monarchists, Hindu nationalists in India, Bolsonaro adherents in Brazil, that there's a kind of adoption of this trolling subcultures, of the humor, of the aesthetics, of the memes, often by young men supportive of these regressive movements. And the last point that I want to point towards is really just based on some observations in terms of how the platform landscape has been shifting over the past few years. I mean, 5-7 years ago, you would have probably still found quite a lot of extremists with very, very large reach on mainstream social media platforms, and most of them. But platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and so Instagram have imperfectly, but they've certainly started to do more about the issue around violent extremism, hate speech, and violent conspiracy theories on their platforms, have increasingly used means of deplatforming some of the most notorious and most harmful and potentially danger-posing actors. And this has led to a migration away from the main platforms, where often extremists don't have the same amount of reach, but they nevertheless are able to mobilize, connect with people across borders, and things like that. Now, I think this is interesting to observe, of course, and it's interesting to wonder, like, to what extent are these more ideologically homogenous spaces that may have less reach? To what extent are they radicalizing each other even further? Is this even more dangerous because people feel like they're being cut off from mainstream political discussion and have no means anymore to influence mainstream politics, and are now in their little niche where they're only surrounded by like-minded people? But I think there's something else that we really need to start wondering about in terms of the shifting platform landscape that's used by extremist actors across the ideological spectrum, and that's that some of these platforms pose different barriers for researching and countering extremist content and behavior. And I think these can really be divided roughly in three boxes, even though you could probably filter them further, which is barriers of fragmentation, that with certain platforms, especially the ones that don't have APIs, you're essentially looking for the needle in the haystack. You're looking, you know that there's probably bad content, and it's might even be public, but you just don't know where you're looking for it. And you really don't have a way of kind of trimming the data down to stuff that's more likely to be relevant. You second have ethical problems, and at times legal problems. On certain platforms, you need to be there's no way to systematically gather data without breaking the terms of service of certain platforms. So this could put you into contract law issues. There similarly can be issues around privacy, where certain areas of platforms are designated as private, even though it would be quite difficult to justify that, say, communities with 12,000 people in which you can openly find calls for violence could really be counted as private, but they technically might be, and they might be perceived as private. So there's ethical issues with researching some of these spaces. And lastly, there are technological barriers on some of these platforms. On Odyssey, which is partially, though not fully, blockchain-based, but also on platforms like PeerTube, which are very popular now, especially in the German-speaking COVID denier scene, in this among these sort of people who are really, really interested in conspiracy theories about COVID, but now also increasingly about Ukraine and the energy crisis, and these hybrid extremist actors that really have become radicalized over the past years. They're very active on platforms like PeerTube that are essentially decentralized on different servers, and where therefore moderation as well as research is very, very difficult. And so just to sum it up again, these are the 6 kind of claims that I wanted to bring into discussion, and through which I wanted to set the scene for the chat that we're about to have. We're seeing an internationalization of the extreme right, at the same time that formal extremist organizations are becoming less relevant, though not irrelevant. The lines between extremism and adjacent harms are becoming blurred. Islamist extremists continue to operate, drawing on a range of formats online to communicate their message. There's a convergence in the aesthetics of different online subcultures across ideologies, kind of the alt-rightification of different online subcultures. And we're seeing a shifting of the platform landscape that's not only potentially contributing to increased radicalizations of people in these more ideologically homogeneous spaces, but that also present barriers to research and also possibly to countering extremist content online. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation over the coming 2 hours.
Thank you so much, Jakob. That's a lot of food for thought, but very nicely packaged. So we could actually remember the main takeaways, as we say. So we already have a question. If platforms used are more peripheral, in the sense of more marginal, how are people being lured in?
It's not always easy to say, but I mean, there are actors who specifically link towards more niche platforms. So there might be, sending links on bigger platforms, directing people towards smaller platforms as well. And there can, of course, just be mouth-to-mouth propaganda. I mean, there's certain people might literally be interested in going on Odyssey or so, and then coming across harmful content. But there's quite a lot of interlinking behavior, and we've done some recent work that really, among UK extremists, is not published yet, but I think it's a finding that I can mention already, that among UK extremists, actually more links now go to platforms like DLive, like Odyssey, then go to, say, Facebook or Reddit. So it is part of the picture, certainly, that platforms are being directly linked to. Though Ashton also is raising her hand and possibly wants to come in right at this very second.
I actually had a question for you, I will, let me just have a look. What was the question in the chat? If platforms used are more peripheral. Yeah, so certainly from my research, they will advertise their more niche or encrypted platforms in their mainstream platforms. So you see this with ISIS and the far right as well. So if you go onto their Twitter, they'll have a link to their Telegram. So they are very interested in operating in the mainstream because that's the way that they can reach out initially. But it is more about moving to that secretive option, which is obviously more difficult for us to monitor and also infiltrate, particularly if you're talking about platforms like VR Chat, DLive, Discord, things like that. But I have a question for Jakob, if that's okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Fascinating stuff. My question is about your overlap between jihadist and far-right content. So I've seen a trend basically since the rise of the alt-right, as you were saying, back in 2014, of them plagiarizing, manipulating each other's aesthetics, propaganda, things like that. I'm wondering in terms of what you've seen, if this is a case of them just using what they know works. So, for example, you see that Atomwaffen and Division will replicate ISIS's training videos. I've seen that you've got male supremacist content in there. Do you think that it's just a case of them just using what works? So they know that the far right was successful with memes, with shit posting. What's your opinion on that stuff, really?
So Fabian was nodding his head, so he may have an even stronger desire than me to come in.
Yeah, I have a big desire because I think this is pretty interesting. I'm also watching that I think all extremists are perfectionating the meme game. Let's say it like this, and I think in the jihadist, I mean, maybe for the discussion afterwards, I think it's really problematic, the cross phenomenon approaches, because I think these are pretty different narratives, and I think this is like a lot of scientists are working on to watch this cross phenomenon approaches. I really don't think this works. I think it's like because ISIS and Al Qaeda and the Taliban, they pulled out a lot of content like Al Qaeda started in the 90s. So there is an online library where youngsters, for instance, can download stuff and cut it together. I think this is like the main thing is how the internet is developing. Like it gets everything gets shorter and not so high quality content. So I think this is the one thing. The other thing is we were like in the project Jamal al-Khatib, we're working like since 2017 in the jihadist scene, and we noticed like beginning in 2018, 2019, that the users that come out of the jihadist scene, that they use like Alman names, but pretty Alman names, like no one has those names right now, like Jakob, I don't know, like Stefan, so this is a form of ironic, I think. So this was the thing I wanted to say. I think like Islamists they use those names as an ironic mention, and they don't copy, they do it like ironic.
I didn't even know that had such a niche name. I always thought it was reasonably well spread, but no, so I mean, it's worth noting also, of course, that even with the alt-right, I mean, like many of the kind of memes are not sort of inherently created by them, but sort of appropriated by wider internet subcultures or wider internet culture just. And so it's not all that surprising that other movements or people in other contexts would sort of have similar ideas. I do think that obviously the alt-right at a certain point was extremely visible and had a lot of media attention, and including the humor and the transgressive nature. And so I think it's to some extent complementary. It is a kind of build yourself your own aesthetics approach. as well as something that people may have seen works quite well. I mean, I think you do, of course, look at like what kind of propaganda approaches worked, what kind of tactics worked previously, and people look across ideological borders here. I mean, for strategies as well, of course.
All right, so we already have this kind of interaction between research and street work, I guess, which is exactly what I wanted to have in this panel, and which reflects the project as well, because the two repositories are basically a more scientific one and a more practical one. Now, I guess I'm going to move on since Ashton already intervened. I'm going to give the floor to her, but first I will introduce, of course, our next speaker. She is a teaching fellow in criminology at the University of Southampton. She is also an advisory board member of the Accelerationism Research Consortium, a research fellow at Voxpol, which is a European research network on online extremism, and a core member of the newly recently established Extremism and Gaming Research Network, for which reason I think her intervention will include some gaming elements, which I'm really looking forward to. She was also at CAR, which is a Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, previously, and her research usually mainly focuses on the far right. She's done something on jihadism as well, so all around expert here with us today. We're looking forward to your input. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Yeah, so my name's Ashton. I spent 4 years undercover in different far-right online networks, ranging from neo-Nazi siege culture to tradwives to eco-fascists to the Klan. Previously to that, I was in Islamic State networks for about 8 months. So I look at the role of imagery and technology as accelerators of radicalization. So I'm going to talk today about the role that video games play in that, and use a few examples of the way that I've looked at video games specifically as jihadist and far-right propaganda over the years. So extremists have always used video games because they know that it works as a strategy for recruitment. They know that people are going to recognize them. They know that it's a way to reach out to the kind of youth who are predominantly the main targets of many extremist organizations. So back in 2006, the Global Islamic Media Front, which is a media branch of Al-Qaeda, released Quest for Bush. So this is a very traditional first-person shooter game in which you would be tasked with tracking down George W. Bush and assassinating him in the most dramatic way possible. I should also note before I continue that this presentation does contain propaganda, although none of it is designed to be nefarious or offensive in nature. So another one of the controversies that we had, 2010, they released Medal of Honor. During this, you could play as the Taliban, which was causing lots of controversy about the extent of which you should be ethically allowed to play on what they would deem as the bad side. So I'm just going to whiz through these examples really quickly, and then if you have questions at the end, please do ask me. Some other examples of games that we have. So Syrian Warfare is a Russian game that was released on a platform called Steam in 2017. You would play as a Syrian civilian, and you would be fighting Islamic State. But interestingly, I've seen Islamic State propagandists take clips from this, particularly with like RPGs and vehicle rammings, and use it as their own, particularly on mods on platforms like YouTube. We also have, this is a 2003 Special Force, which is a Hezbollah video game in which you are fighting Israel. So different types of extremist organizations have used video games as this kind of recruitment method in the past. With ISIS, in their propaganda videos, so those of you that will know that they were very famous for having these really glossily, slickly made propaganda. A lot of their fight kill scenes are designed to be the most spectacular as possible. So we see this in the kind of way that we would have in Mortal Kombat. A lot of the videos are first-person shooter footage. So again, it gives the person who is looking at the videos the illusion that they are holding the guns themselves. Super important strategy that ISIS were using. We also see this with the Christchurch shooter. So a lot of the work I do is on gamification. So this is the application of kind of typical gaming elements to unrelated aspects. We saw one of these in Jakob's presentation actually with the leaderboard. That's a classic example of gamification. Anyone that's had the unpleasantness of viewing the Christchurch shooters video will know that a lot of it is designed to be shot like a video game. And we've also had video games that are designed to replicate that shooting in which players can act it out themselves. Another key thing about ISIS was their manipulation of Grand Theft Auto. With extremist organizations, they will often use the most well-known video games because, again, they're trying to reach out and attract a certain type of audience. The more well-known the game, the more people are going to resonate with it. There was all this controversy about ISIS having their own version of GTA, which is untrue. In actual fact, what they had done is clip together scenes within the game that they had utilized themselves. This isn't necessarily coming from ISIS centrally, but more the grassroots. So a lot of that propaganda is through things like modding on games as well. In terms of the far right, one of the games that I've seen a lot of propaganda is Wolfenstein 2, which is set in 1961 in an alternative universe in which the Nazis won the war and have taken over America. Interesting things in here are the utilization of aesthetics, the way that that has been used to promote meme culture, and also the way that they depict the Klan. They do this in Red Dead Redemption 2 as well. They depict the Klan as being these kind of uncultured, stupid rednecks, almost giving the illusion that they're not a threat, and they are this kind of old historical version of white supremacy that isn't really up to scratch with what the new neo-Nazis are. We also have in Red Dead Redemption 2, a lot of the footage within this is used within meme culture. And one of the things that I like to heavily kind of put out when it comes to open world games is a lot of this isn't built into the games, right? So it's not the games themselves, it's the players that are utilizing open world scenarios to create this propaganda. So we see this with male supremacism. This is God of War that was manipulated following an Italian terrorist attack by Luca Traini. And also, I'm sure we've all seen the images of Trump as Warhammer 40,000, very popular there. One of the things that I wrote quite heavily about was the way that Far Cry 5 was used, particularly the artwork, in different types of far-right propaganda. Those of you that know about Far Cry franchise, they tend to shy away from any kind of real-world replications. This came out in around the time of the rise of Trump and depicts this kind of radical Christian fundamentalist American doomsday cult called Eden's Gate. A lot of parallels with the Bundys and their uprisings, a lot of parallels with Waco, the main character in this, Joseph Seed, the charismatic leader, lots of parallels with David Koresh that have been used by both anti-government extremists and far-right adherents to use this artwork within propaganda. I do a lot of work on Assassin's Creed. So again, super popular video game utilized by the identitarian movement to project this kind of alt history, that Scandinavian history, the Greeks, the Romans represent this kind of utopian idea of what future ethno-states would look like. So you see this artwork manipulated with these kind of key identitarian sayings that you will see a lot from the image-based wing of that particular movement. And just to finish off, in terms of gaming and extremism, there are a lot of platforms that are concerned. Some of the main ones, Discord, DLive, Twitch, VR chat, not only for displaying propaganda, but also live streaming attacks and different types of extremists using them to get money and funding. I've got some screenshots here from when I was on VR chat where you can just hop in and out of servers. This particular event, there was this kind of weird Nazi dinner party where it was set at Wewelsburg Castle, which is the spiritual center for the SS in Germany. Famously gave birth to the Sonnenrad or Black Sun. That's where that symbol comes from. So you're in this kind of weird alternate reality server where you can dress up as the Klan, as SS members. That is the Oslo shooter there. And one of the things about this, obviously, it's incredibly difficult to monitor this, incredibly difficult to get the ethical clearance to enter these servers. And also it's very difficult to police live chat, which is what's going on in these kind of environments. So thank you so much for listening. Any questions? I know I whizzed through a lot of things super quickly, so happy to answer any questions that you might have. And thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ashton. This is impressive and scary at the same time, I guess, considering that indeed, such platforms and video games are so accessible to so many, especially young people. So I guess following up on this, do you think, I mean, obviously there's still lots of research to be done in terms of what are the effects, what is the impact of games used by extremists, of gamification. But would you say, from what you've seen, also perhaps as kind of undercover participant, what would you say, what does it do to you? So when you're in these kinds of spaces, what does it do to your mind? Or do you feel, like a peer pressure?
My mind, I lost that a long time ago in this case. No, I actually do a lot of work on research ethics. Those of you that will know me and my work, I look at institutional responsibility for caring for research safety. I mean, I think it'd be interesting to hear other people's opinions, particularly those that have looked at the gaming related, connections or in this space. But I think with gaming, it's super difficult to determine who is actually subscribing to these ideologies and who is just pissing about. I see this a lot with modding, particularly like there's so many ISIS mods of Arma 3. And you're like, okay, so does this person actually subscribe to Islamic State ideology? Are they just trying to make themselves look like a cool aesthetic? You see it with the, the building of the concentration camps in Minecraft and stuff like that. Does this person actually want a genocide, or are they just trying to recreate this space for the lulz? So I think it's really difficult when it comes to trying to decipher, particularly with a strategy, right, of what you do to combat it, because I'm asked quite a lot, do you how can you separate who you would target as a potential extremist and how you would differentiate that from someone that is having a laugh? You see this with the kind of anti-Semitism and racism masked within meme culture as well, and the people that hide behind humor. When I was at a conference recently in the summer, it was about like cottagecore, right? So if you're on TikTok, do you stop every single picture of a cottage because it could potentially have links to trad wives or identitarian philosophy? Or do you just let it go as a kind of one-off? And I think gaming is very like this, right? It's really difficult to try and police it because it's live chat, and that would involve the researcher putting themselves in a potentially dangerous situation. And also you have to get them to trust you. So it's the ethical quandary of falsifying who you are and manipulating them to let you in. And to what extent would you suggest that as being the core kind of method of trying to counter it? I'd be interested in other people's thoughts on that.
And of course, what we've seen is also not just in gaming, but in general, thinking about Prevent, for example, casting a very broad net.
Yeah.
So,
let's not stop.
Yeah, let's not go there. We actually have one more question, which is, so it's about future trends. So what do you see as future trends when it comes to the gamification of extremist ideologies, both far right and jihadist? I mean, I know it's difficult to predict the future, but I guess as researchers are always asked at least to, give an educated guess.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people are doing some good work around the utilization of blockchain, the use of different platforms for live streaming. I know Jakob was talking about the really serious implications of alt tech, so having decentralized social networks where the platform, particularly if you're talking about a mainstream kind of large social network, doesn't have the authority to take that content down. I think we see a lot more of that. I mean, my main focus in terms of technology is on AI and like the emerging quantum internet and things like that. So I think that extremists have always used technologies, particularly as they emerge. In relation to gaming, I think that's only going to continue and worsen, particularly as technology becomes more sophisticated in terms of circumventing platform restrictions as well. And I think that gaming, I know I never blame the people that make the video games for the manipulation by extremists of their content. But I think that there could be more of an awareness that this happens, and maybe not try and create scenarios as much that, you know, could be manipulated by different types of extremist groups. Like, we're writing a chapter at the moment on Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and the fact that the Ubisoft knew that they would be appropriated by Nazis, and they had a statement out that said that, and yet they're trying to counter it, but they make the most sensationalized, inaccurate historical version of Scandinavian society at the same time. So I think it's also about getting people to forward think a bit more about how, so instead of being reactionary, like, oh my God, an extremist has used my platform for this reason, thinking about it in terms of how they might be able to prevent that in the future, I think is a good strategy.
Exactly. I mean, these are things that you need to think about also when you create interventions. So, for example, also for our website, we had a discussion of whether or not to put symbols online, because whenever whenever you do awareness raising, you're basically also spreading the propaganda potentially as well, depending on what you're showing. So that's always something to think about. But your own role, as it were.
Yeah, I think you raised a really good point about the decision to share. I know it's a very common thing, particularly, I mean, I personally don't share. I do a lot of work around anti-Black caricatures, and I personally don't share them because you can describe the image without showing the image, if you know what I mean. But I think that for some of the symbols, it's necessary. You need to show them, as long as you're countering and giving the counter narrative to that and deconstructing why it is manipulative and wrong. Otherwise, people won't necessarily be aware that those symbols mean certain things.
Yeah, so I guess we'll continue the conversation in the consortium. I was actually for showing this. We'll see.
Yeah, so
all right. Well, thank you very much, you both. There were really two strong interventions from the research side of life, plus active participant observation. We were going to switch now to the practical side of things, what's going on in the streets. And how can we use all this knowledge to actually work with young people and also work with youth workers, because they, of course, need training every now and then. So we're going to continue with Werner Prinzjakowitsch, who is a very experienced expert in this field. He is the head of pedagogics of the Viennese youth centers. Also head of the RAN working group on families, youth and communities, and now I think the RAN ambassador for Austria. So somebody who has an eye on the practical side of things, but also on what's going on in the rest of Europe. So I'm going to give you the floor to reflect a little bit on implications for youth work, but also developments that you might have noticed in the practical work, in which we researchers perhaps are not even aware of. 5 minutes as before, so floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I do not have prepared any slides, so I will just talk. Even more, it will be important to stop me, maybe. A brief correction in the beginning. I'm the former co-chair of a working group of the RAN network. So
It was, if I'm not, but yeah.
But still connected with the network, of course. Listening to what has been said so far, I think my first, in the last minutes, I thought, oh, if I start talking here, this will be a kind of counterpoint to everything that has been said before. But actually, it's not a counterpoint. Actually, it's an addition, or I think an additional, and from my point of view, important, different kind of view. I mean, in our work in youth centers, but also as in detached youth work on the streets in Vienna, in our case, we are mainly, almost only connected to kind of the average young people, average young people with a focus on persons with some lower economic and educational background. Actually connecting to what has been said so far, quite sure to young people who are more or less into gaming also, not only, like it's predominantly a male topic anyway. And just usually our connection to the extremism topic, being online or offline, is rather a thing that happens by chance and not by the way that we focus on that from the beginning and are looking for something on that direction. But on the other hand, I think for our approach, that's also a strength, because like UFERC, the core, or one of the cores of UFERC, and one of the strengths and one of the impacts we can make is that we have to be in the world of young people, in the life, a part of young people permanently. And luckily, and that would maybe for later, there were some 2 or 3 questions that came up in the prior presentations. I'll come to that. So luckily, like our observations are that among those young people, like all what has been said before, is by quantity, by the number of involved youngsters, it's not a big thing, no matter which direction of extremism. At one of the other point, we come along as some science. Therefore, and that's already like a learning for you from what you are doing, and also from what the project is, that one important thing is still that youth workers need to be aware of science, of memes, of symbols. Therefore, I'm also a fan of like in the proper education for youth workers, you have to show the symbols, and otherwise, because otherwise nobody would recognize its meanings when you come along. As I said, usually by chance. So the big strength we have is one specific word that I think, that Ashton just said when she does her research, and that's trust. I fully agree that like working in that field, from our approach, which is not the law enforcement approach, definitely, is without trust and without relationship, nothing works. So we have to establish that. Luckily, in the majority of cases, we can establish that in a positive way already with young people that might be in danger of going on a wrong track, no matter of which way. That could be extremism, that could be drugs, that could be any kind of wrong track. And as soon as at least a small relationship is established, and a certain level of trust is achieved, if then something comes up, and if then the youth worker is properly equipped with knowledge on the topic, then our work has some impact. My question I would like to raise, maybe not to answer immediately, but during the discussion, is if you have an estimation about what kind of the quantity of, or the size of the harm that could be, or the quantity, the numbers of persons, for example, involved in those be it in games or in any other online discussions, because something also Ashton had said, I think this is also really important, and it's also something sometimes a real challenge for us, is to make a difference. Just because some youngsters on any online platform, and actually we are like our relationship with the youngsters we know, and that's one of the major points, it's offline and online. And basically it's always both. It's sometimes there are other cases with just people knowing offline, but as almost everybody has some online activities and is present in some online platforms, you nowadays automatically also get connected with this person in the online world. But on vice versa, we are not going to any online platforms just for being at the platform. We are there because some youngsters are there that we already know. So also like the majority or almost 100% of our online connections are young people we also know offline. And I think this would be really challenging, like doing what Fabian in his organization sometimes actually does, but I guess he will say something about that. It is starting the thing from an online relationship. But that's just not our approach, not to say that it's not important to do things like that. But to make a differentiation, if you see something online that is suspicious for you, it's like, but was this just for fun? Did the guy or the person have a bad day, or is this really something serious? Exactly what you mentioned. That's one of the main challenges. Luckily, in the majority of cases, in a very big majority of cases, it's nothing serious. Like it was like also our work is like what my colleagues telling me, every single conflict among young people, 9 out of 10 street fights or planned street fights. Okay, if there are 10 planned street fights, then in the end, one of those 10 really happens. But all of them have some origin in some online communication nowadays. That's not yet extremism, but still important. But so my big points would be the differentiation. I would really strongly support that. This is one of the big challenges, and like platforms like the one you provided help on that. And my big question to the first two presenters is, do we have an estimation or a kind of quantification of threats that are there? Is this even possible? I mean, if you tell me it's not possible, I would immediately believe that it's not. I mean, we all would wish for that. But I think this would be some important thing to look at. Yeah, stop for now. That was more than 5 minutes anyway already. But Daniela didn't stop me.
Well, it was so interesting, and it was only like 1 minute more, so that was justifiable. We have some questions from the audience as well. So maybe we start with those, and then I give you guys some time to think about the numbers in the meantime. So first question is, how do we make sure that youth workers are on top of new memes, ideologies, developments that are going so fast? I mean, I can say that at least what the repositories are concerned, the idea is to continuously update them. So it's not like the project is over and that's it. Website freezes, but the idea is to continuously update with new developments that go on. But perhaps also from your perspectives, how do you keep up with the new developments in the practical work, in the research, maybe starting with Werner and then continuing with the other two?
I mean, that's first, it's a good question. Second, of course, good questions usually are hard to answer, but you never can ensure that. I think we have to be as honest, because one, youth work from my point of view is as a youth worker, you are usually very broad, as you're generally working with the average youngster. I know that there's no average youngster existing, but like with the big mass of young people, my recommendation for my colleagues would rather be that they're not specialists on anything, because they have to be prepared for everything. And that's a bit the big challenge, because you can't be an expert in all the topics that are relevant for young people. So it's rather important that you need to know your resources. That could be a database, it could be books written or in old style, but even more, practically more important is that there are specialists in the background that are reachable on a low threshold for asking immediately. And networking with those other institutions, also including law enforcement, for example, if it's getting really tough. But sometimes in a very few cases it happens, but it happens. And for that, what I learned in the last basically 10 years, I do this work for a lot longer already. It got focused on the extremism and radicalization topic slightly in the last 10 years. And like my connections, and also in that case, relationships of trust with some members of the law enforcement were also really helpful. And in the same way, it's helpful that we have some support from institutions like the extremism counseling services where Fabian works. And in the best thing for a youth worker is that you establish doubts if you see something, and then you, on short notice, you should know at least where to look at or whom to ask about, for example, what you saw in the internet.
All right, moving on to the research part of our panel. Just briefly, how do you guys keep up with the new developments? Are you on certain channels all the time? How do you monitor to a certain extent? And then maybe you also combined with the other question, is there any way to assess the size of the problem? Because I mean, can you know if this is even, representative, or what is the size of the chunk of the pie that you're looking at now as compared to the rest? Maybe starting with Ashton first, ladies first.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so to answer the sort of how do I keep up with, okay, so when I did my research, I was on like every platform you can ever think of with sock puppet accounts everywhere, because I was specifically looking at the cross-platform comparisons, and I was looking at Web 1.0 as well. The way that I keep up with it now is I'm very lucky to be part of some incredible networks. Particularly the Accelerationism Research Consortium has researchers like Marc-Andre Argentino, who are always monitoring everything, and everyone kind of monitors their own platform. So I keep up with the trends like that, because I'm not in that space anymore. So I can't look at the content necessarily myself for ethical reasons. In terms of the latter of that question, okay, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I would never look at the numbers of things. And in fact, my PhD was a percentage of computer science, and my internal examiner, was a computer scientist, and they were very confused as to my methods of just using one image and really decoding and decloaking the kind of intrinsic like meanings within that. But one thing that I do find interesting is that when we're trying to quantify how big a problem extremist propaganda or content is online, a lot of what you see is what's left after it's already been removed by platforms, AI, machine learning, takedowns. And I think that's really interesting to remember. You really have no idea about the true amount that was originally posted to that site or in that group. And that's another reason why I think it's really difficult to quantify how big the problem actually is, because so much of it is already removed. So I'll leave it there for...
It makes sense. I mean, it's probably an argument to say, it's important to cooperate with such platforms, because they are the ones who know the size of the content that at least they themselves remove. Jakob, do you guys, are you on any channels or?
Yes, many. I mean, we essentially have 3 pillars of our research. I mean, we also don't have the silver bullet or the capacity or the enough resources to do it all and stay always on top of everything. But we essentially have worked together with quite a lot of computer scientists who sort of help the subject matter experts to, access through the platform APIs where it's available or possible to access sort of large-scale data and then analyze that with different techniques. So it's the kind of quant side. Then we have a fairly large digital research team that's sitting across a range of platforms, communities, and so on to kind of like monitor the trends on a more qualitative level, because I mean the quant side only makes so much sense if you don't understand the codes. And then lastly, we have a few people with a background in open source intelligence who can, look at web infrastructure, financial ways of online finance, payment mechanisms, and almost more the kind of like background side and what kind of networks exist and so on. So we're kind of relying on these 3 pillars to do monitoring. Sometimes it's retrospectively, we want to find out what happened last year. Sometimes it's ongoing in the lead up to some specific event. But that's sort of the approach that we're taking there. It is though to very much agree with that, very, very hard. And so it's important to draw on other people's work. It's important to contextualize some of the observations that we have about online activity with the polling and surveying with representative samples that's out there. Because I mean, if you look online, you can easily construe a case that conspiracy theories have been going through the roof and that they're sort of, exploding, and there's way more people believing all kinds of stuff. The kind of academic literature in that field, and this is across a range of other attitude indicators as well. I mean, it is actually like much more of a flat line, and these people may be more mobilized and they may have formed communities online and so, but it's not necessarily the case that, for example, belief adherence to conspiracy theories or kind of extreme right beliefs have drastically grown over the past few years. So I think it's also very important to contextualize both quantitative and qualitative observations of digital behavior with the representative sampling methodologies that are out there.
All right, Ashton, did you want to reply to Jakob's?
I actually had a question for the speaker, if that's okay.
Which one?
The one that just spoke.
All right.
while we're on the topic. It was really interesting to hear what you had to say, and because I am very much in the online space, I'm fascinated to kind of hear more about how you would look for someone that was a potential at risk person, basically. Like, what are the risk factors that you would look out for someone that was vulnerable to these kind of ideologies? Are there any gateway things that they might mention? Like, I'm just really interested to hear from on the ground what you look out for.
Usually not quite what we do, I would say. I mean,
oh,
we
no,
are more.
Sorry, I was directing that to
Oh, okay. So this is to Werner.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't make that very clear. Yeah, because I see you as being like very online as well, IST. Yeah, I was just wondering from the street level what you would look out for.
Perhaps Werner and also Fabian afterwards, because I think both of you have insights.
I mean, yeah. As I mentioned, generally, I wouldn't. No, I definitely would say that we are not specifically monitoring persons along specific things they are doing, they are saying. I think the UFOCUS must be equipped with a certain sensitivity, and see that if that's the point. It's in the main cases, it's persons that we are working with. We know the person for a while, and but like the classical thing is that you observe some change in the person, be it in behavior. I mean, it's it's young people, so it's adolescent. So there's permanent change on one hand, of course. On the other hand, there are some specific indicators. I'd say if persons start behaving in a different way, actually it's rather emotional signs, I even would say. Like person being more aggressive, or even being less aggressive, or like being in retreat. And then you would approach him or her and say, is there something specific going on? And maybe connected with, as I said, with the majority, of also connected online through the popular networks, of course. So Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, and often then it's that you also watch Instagram, TikTok, and you see that this person has shared something which you think, what's that? If you have a sensitivity for the memes, for the symbols, and that's something you need. And then it's really slow, and actually always, I would say, I mean, that would be my tip for all the colleagues, an indirect approach. I mean, let's like, I have, that's not an individual example, and it's not online, but I think it's a brilliant example. I mean, there was a certain community group in Vienna that was seen as being more vulnerable for leaving to Syria. And there were people that had the idea, oh, they are specifically vulnerable, this community, so we should do something on that. And they wanted to start specific workshops on extremism and offering to this community. And I think, yeah, Fabian is nothing, because the two of us were there at a workshop before they started it. And I think we both said, if you start with that and with that offer, then we can ensure you that you won't have success. Because if you approach the person in a way like, I'm thinking you are vulnerable to this or that even doesn't matter on which, then you will never start a relationship of trust, because they would immediately say, what do you think? What do you think? So it's like, it's the same with economic background. Like, so just today, some TV station asked us a report about poor children from a and they want to get into contact with them, and we said no. First, for ethical reasons, we won't give you the contacts of those, and we also would understand. I mean, you can go ask specifically young people, like, because of the economic situation, and it's so bad for you. Would you like to give an interview for us? That's not the way to approach people, neither for journalists, and for sure not for youth workers or for social workers. So therefore, as I said before, it's the sensitivity, and then the way you approach people, then that's again a different story. And it's usually not the extremism topic, but there will be for sure something in what the person has posted where you can make a connection. Be it, yeah, like your own, and even just playing the naive game somehow and saying, I've seen recently you posted that on Instagram. I do not understand. Can you explain to me why? What does that mean? And why did you post it? Because I don't totally. For me, it's weird. And sometimes actually this isn't the honest approach even. Yeah.
This is a great Übergang to my topic. Thank you so much, Werner. What you said in the last statement, to ask someone who knows it. I think this is my approach, because I think like my research or monitoring we make it with youngsters together. So all my online projects, all or extremism monitoring we do together with youngsters, former quitters from the extremist scene, because they know what it's about. It's like this simple.